Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Thomas. Today we're back here with extra history. We got a complete history on this one. So it's on Theodore Roosevelt, Trustbuster. So yeah, basically him trying to get the business conglomerates, Standard Oil, railroad companies. I guess you'll see what's up in a minute. So yeah, let's just see Theodore's war on business. Let's see it. Be sure to subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Here we go.
Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1872. Down with the conspirators, reads one banner. No compromise, says another. The protesters, small independent oil refiners, marched toward the railroad junction, led by local oilman Franklin Tarbell. They swarm over the rail yard, flipping rail cars, spilling their cargo of oil barrels, and smashing open any marked with the Standard Oil logo. News has leaked that John D. Rockefeller's rising giant, the Standard Oil Company, has brokered a secret deal with the railroads. The rail barons will double their transportation rates on all oil producers, but give Standard a rebate, driving small independent producers out of business so Rockefeller can buy them out. But despite the Pennsylvania legislature dissolving this backroom deal, things are already in motion. Through strong-arm tactics and ruthless expansion, Standard will soon control the U.S. oil market, making Rockefeller the richest person on Earth. Franklin Tarbell cannot stop Rockefeller. No man can, because it will be Franklin's 14-year-old daughter, Ida, who will break Standard Oil. And while you're watching this episode, be sure that your internet security doesn't break by using NordVPN.
That's good. All right, Chapter 1, Big Oil.
By the turn of the 20th century, a few massive corporations, often called the trusts, due to the corporate structure they were organized under, dominated American life. From railroads to meat to steel and oil, trusts strangled competition and wielded more political power than many senators and governors. But in 1901, the trusts would find a new opponent, a president unexpectedly thrust into the role, Theodore Roosevelt, who would usher in the era of trust busting.
Hated the nickname Teddy.
Yet the story of trust busting doesn't begin with him. Because while Roosevelt disliked the monopolies, to take on such powerful business interests, he would need massive public support for action. Public support that would not come from Washington, but from a magazine office. The offices of McClure's Magazine, New York City, 1901. In the 31 years after her father fought Standard in Titusville, Ida Tarbell has come a long way. She's now 44 years old and an editor at the prestigious magazine McClure's. One of the few American women with a science degree, she became a specialist in writing about technical topics like public works and the military, as well as blockbuster serialized biographies of Napoleon and Abraham Lincoln. But as Tarbell and her research assistant shuffle through contracts, corporate documents, legislative transcripts, and interviews, it's quickly becoming clear that this next story will be her biggest yet. A history of the Standard Oil Company, its rise, and its misdeeds. A series so dangerous that Tarbell's father warns her not to do it. In fact, the magazine's funding has already been threatened by a Rockefeller-owned bank. But Tarbell
can't blame him. Or at least can't blame Tarbell's father, Ida's. Does he know, what Rockefeller can do to you? Not sure what the consequences were for what Franklin did. Imagine he'd been locked up for a while. Considering, let her riot on the railways, got, oil just broken open. Her going into a hit piece on that and be like, whoa, careful. You don't know what happened to me. Or at least that's what I'm thinking. Let's keep going.
This is a new kind of journalism. One that relies on public documents, legislative and court transcripts, and verifiable facts, in addition to interviews. It's so new that the discipline doesn't even have a name yet, though today we call it investigative journalism.
There you go.
Now, the magazine decided to look at Standard because, unlike the rest of the trusts, it had a single owner and will be an easier story to tell. The history of Standard will provide a window into how these companies control American commerce. And Tarbell's first task is looking at the earliest days of Standard Oil and its founder, John D. Rockefeller. Born in upstate New York in 1839, Rockefeller grew up in financial insecurity. His father, Doc Rockefeller, was a con artist who masqueraded as a doctor, selling fake cures on the road. So during his absence, John was forced to step up, raising turkeys to help the family. His mother, a devout Baptist, taught him the principles of hard work, thrift, and charitable giving. while his father, by
Fair.
contrast, taught his children by swindling them as a way to keep them sharp. In fact, once, Doc Rockefeller held out his arms, urging young John to jump from a high chair into his grasp. Then, when John took the leap, Doc just let him fall. "Never trust anyone completely," he told his son. "Even me." Doc ditched the family when Rockefeller was 16, disappearing from public record. Young John became a bookkeeper to support the family, and then by age 20 had gone into business for himself, branching into refining oil with several partners. But by 1870, he'd pushed said partners out and took control of what was now dubbed Standard Oil. America ran on oil, specifically kerosene, which lit homes in a way that was cleaner and more efficient than whale oil. And that was exactly how Rockefeller liked things. Clean and efficient. And as Tarbell researches his methods, she finds herself impressed, indeed even admiring Rockefeller. He was a major innovator, because at the time, when refining petroleum, often only about 60% became usable as kerosene, while much of the rest were flammable byproducts that they dumped into rivers and lakes, making them occasionally catch on fire. But Rockefeller turned many of these byproducts into lubricants, chewing gum, paint, and even figured out that one of the biggest waste products, gasoline, could fuel his factory machinery. And while Tarbell applauded these innovations, her admiration didn't extend to Rockefeller's business practices. He expanded aggressively, buying out his competitors. And if they didn't take his offer, he'd undercut their prices and dive rivals into unprofitability before purchasing the ruined corporations. And this was a thing he didn't just do to rivals, but also friends who'd helped him get started in business. He also began to expand vertically, buying barrel makers, oil producers, distributors, lumber companies, and chemical manufacturers, so he could control every part of the supply and distribution chain. And eventually...
Yeah, so it's not just, refining the oil. Now he wants every part of the process. Yeesh. Honestly, I see why he's doing the ruthless, era of business here. Considering, considering the father, I'm not surprised. But still, harsh, huh? Really, I don't know if I would have ended up like that if I was, in Rockefeller's shoes, but still. Really. Anyway.
He would invest in pipelines, so Standard could stop paying railroads and move its product more efficiently. Rockefeller also had, let's say, a strange feeling about capitalism and money. He looked on his mission to expand Standard as almost a divine calling.
So it's like a manifest destiny?
He was making the oil market more efficient and costs lower. He treated employees well and rewarded those who took his buyouts. But if they resisted, he bankrupted them without mercy, often via secret deals. It was God's will, he believed, for the strong and well-run to conquer the weak and inefficient. In 1872, Standard bought 22 of its 26 rival oil producers in Ohio within 3 months, an event remembered as the Cleveland Massacre. And it was only the start. For within a decade, Standard would control 90% of the U.S. oil market and about 85% of the global market. As she begins to write, Tarbell reflects that she does not begrudge Rockefeller's success, or even Standard's growth. It's the tactics she considers unfair. Standard offering products at such a discount that competition was forced to sell and become part of it. The backroom deals, bribery of public officials. Tactics like the South Improvement Company, the entity formed in order to facilitate the secret deal between Standard and the railroad companies that put her father out of business. She finds a book about Pennsylvania's investigation of the deal in the New York Public Library, the only remaining copy after Standard destroyed the rest. She gathers details from legislative minutes and lawsuits, turning rumor into fact, forming a picture of the Southern Improvement Scheme and uncovering evidence that even after the deal fell apart, Standard continued to collude with the railroads to get anti-competitive rebates on shipping its products. But she finds more than that. Crossing the country, she talks to grocers driven out of business by Standard. Standard employees would come threaten them, saying that if the grocers refused to switch to Standard products, the company would open a rival store. And they would follow through, offering such discounted goods that no grocer could survive. She also charted how Standard's reorganization as a trust in 1885 actually circumvented antitrust laws. Many states forbid a single company working across state lines. So, Standard formed a trust company in New York that gave orders to smaller state-based companies with names like Standard of Ohio. In truth, Rockefeller controlled them all. But Tarbell had an odd ally in understanding Standard. Henry Rogers, the trust's vice president. Believing the articles will be complimentary, he granted her access,
Little does he
answering
know.
every charge she made, helping her understand Standard's perspective. However, when the article
Womp
is
womp.
published, he would not like what she had to say,
Eh.
because she'd learned far more than Rogers knew, and she learned it from an unusual source. 1904, New York City. Tarbell can see the man is nervous. He wants to leave. He stammers out a story about a kid he teaches in Sunday school, an office boy at Standard headquarters, the one who burns documents. Except when the boy saw his teacher's name on some of the papers, rather than putting them in the furnace, he brought them to him instead. The man, you see, is also a small-time oil refiner. Tarbell opens the man's briefcase and sees a stack of paper. Price lists, train tables, distribution routes, all with dates and amounts. But none of these are for Standard's products. They're for Standard's competitors. And this information is all Standard needs to undercut its rivals, flood markets, and manipulate oil prices to stay on top. It's hard evidence of something that Tarbell has suspected for years. Standard bribes railroad agents to provide data on its competitors' shipments. Rockefeller isn't preternaturally good at reading the market. He's just running a nationwide espionage network. And it's this revelation that will win her the support and attention of a new fan, President Theodore Roosevelt.
Jeez. Okay. Honestly, if I was in government, I hear about this, I'd be like, oh, we gotta shut this guy down fast. Don't care, get him out now. Anyway, now to the regulators.
Cleveland, 1905. John D. Rockefeller enters the Baptist church he's attended since he was 14. A church that's still full of blacksmiths and shopkeepers, people he's known his whole life. Things haven't been easy. That Tarbell woman's articles have turned the world against him. His family is suffering nervous conditions, his wife paralyzed by stroke, and an unknown disorder has caused all of his hair, including his eyelashes and eyebrows, to fall out. For years, he'd let people treat his estate like a public park, but now he's building a fence. Armed Pinkerton bodyguards follow him everywhere, and he sleeps with a revolver by his bed. Even that cowboy president Teddy Roosevelt is after him, despite how generous Standard has been to Republican politicians. But at least he feels safe here, at his church, where he gives Sunday school lectures and hands envelopes of money to parishioners who have fallen on hard times. His people. He doesn't see Ida Tarbell sitting a few pews away. Ida Tarbell's series, A History of the Standard Oil Company, ran in McClure's magazine until 1905, and it completely changed public attitudes about trusts and big business. Granted, when the big trusts like Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel were building themselves in the 19th century, they had caused a great deal of controversy within their industries on a state-by-state basis, but that anger and mistrust was unfocused. The business structures of these trusts were, often intentionally on the part of the trusts, difficult for the public to understand. Holding companies obscured the sheer scale of the trusts, and anti-competitive practices like railroad rebates and price fixing were so technical and detail-oriented, it was hard for individual citizens to pin down exactly what was wrong. Sure, there had been some legislative action on Standard, such as in 1892, for example, when the state of Ohio managed to use antitrust laws to separate Standard of Ohio from the rest of the company, but corporate reshuffles or protracted legal battles often blunted even these small victories. But now, Tarbell exposed how a network of 250 companies, many related in Byzantine deals, controlled everything from the price consumers paid for vegetables and alcohol to working conditions and hours across multiple industries. More importantly, though, it presented this information cleanly by centering the investigation on Standard, the one trust owned and controlled by a single man. This kept the story comprehensible and gave the readers a central character to rally against. In fact, often, she described Rockefeller and Standard as if they were the same entity, even after he had retired to focus on charity. And she decided to close the series with a two-part personal sketch of Rockefeller himself, which is where the usually reserved Tarbell let the venom flow. Describing him in church, she wrote that he looked like a living mummy, hairless and reptilian, powerful yet nervous, a ruthless king, terrified of assassins who might be in his midst. But in action...
I mean, to be fair, you had, the whole public after you, giving you the stink eye. There is a high chance of, one of them deciding, to kill you. So, yeah. I can't blame him for having a gun by his bed, When you got all that money, someone's bound to get it. I mean, heck, look up lottery stories. You can definitely see what's up. Sheesh. Anyway.
Duality. Rockefeller was not the broken man Tarbell suggested. Even as his family suffered under the public strain, Rockefeller kept playing golf and running his charitable foundation. Granted, getting annoyed whenever a prominent religious organization turned away a donation of his as tainted money, but still, he stayed silent,
again,
believing the controversy would only grow if he dignified it with a response. It grew anyway. Tarbell's series sparked a national sensation. She exposed family secrets, like that Rockefeller's father, Doc Rockefeller, had fled New York with the family after being indicted for rape. A scandal that only deepened when her research assistant caught wind that Doc was still alive, living under an assumed name. So now finding Doc Rockefeller also became a brief national fixation, with publishing magnates Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst dispatching reporters as far away as Alaska to try and find the man. However, by the time they did, he was already dead. His poor widow, not realizing her marriage had been bigamous, and her husband's son, the richest man in America, had buried him under the assumed name of Livingston. With that minor side quest completed, the concepts of trust and their impact on American life began becoming topics discussed at porches and town halls across the country due to Tarbell's articles. After decades of unfocused discomfort over monopolies, there finally seemed specific charges to answer and the political will to do something about the trusts. A public mandate that was a godsend to America's new president, Theodore Roosevelt. A reformer and longtime critic of trusts, Roosevelt had unsuccessfully attempted to pass anti-monopoly legislation in the past as governor of New York. But keep in mind, this was an era of the political machine, where party bosses held sway over elected and appointed officials in a dirty system of patronage and reward, which of course current society in America could never relate to today.
Trump.
Conservative Republicans in New York, plus the Democrats of the Tammany Hall machine, had hamstrung Roosevelt's progressive agenda, stonewalling his attempts to clean up state politics and enact antitrust laws. Because Republicans were the party of big business, and both they and the old guard at Tammany regularly took bribes and campaign contributions from Standard, specifically so they would kill unfriendly legislation. Indeed.
So basically, it was more of a, give and take, give you money to help support something you want, and you help them out when something threatens them. Almost like a favor system in a way, You do something for them, we do something for you, yada, yada, yada. That's how the political system worked at the time. Oh boy. I mean, still kind of get that nowadays, especially with world liberty. Sorry, I had to point that up. I saw it on 60 Minutes the other night, so I was like, okay, this is definitely sounding like that. Anyway.
The reason Roosevelt had been nominated as vice president in the 1900 Republican Convention was that New York Republicans hoped that they could get Roosevelt and his progressive reform campaigns out of New York politics.
Yeah, about
President McKinley was sure to win re-election, they reasoned, meaning Roosevelt would be neutralized in a subordinate role with little power. It worked for a while, because 5 months into McKinley's term, an anarchist shot and killed him. And Roosevelt could suddenly use the power of the executive branch to go after the trusts. So in February of 1902, 9 months before Tarbell's first Standard Oil article even appeared, Roosevelt took his first swing at the trusts. His target was the Northern Securities Company, a holding company created by the two largest rail competitors in the Midwest and West Coast, with financing by banking titan J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. Their goal was to control all of the rail lines between the Great Lakes and the ports of the Pacific Northwest, a monopoly that, as we saw with Standard, could grant a huge amount of power to set prices and control commerce. Roosevelt's weapon was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a rarely used piece of federal legislation which had been passed after a number of massive corporate mergers in the 1880s. The Sherman Act gave the federal government power to break up any organization or contract found to be restraining trade, and had mostly been used against unions. Roosevelt...
Honestly, at this point, it does sound like it is restricting trade. Not to mention we saw earlier about the whole, pulling their prices, so that way we can undercut theirs and, yoink. So yeah, it does sound like it's not taking out the fair competition on it, You gotta let them have choice, otherwise, what's the point?
Instructed the Justice Department to sue and break up Northern Securities as an illegal combination. And when the department followed through, Northern Securities then appealed the decision and entered a protracted court battle. Now, Roosevelt had gone out on a limb for that fight, particularly because a significant part of his own party were pro-business and financially dependent on the trust heads. In fact, a
Not
group of
surprised.
conservative Republicans even revolted against him, openly plotting to nominate one of their own in the 1904 election and make this cowboy a one-term president. It
We'll
was
see
a
how long
bruising
that lasts.
political season for Roosevelt. Actually, quite literally in a way, because, fun fact,
Oh.
while all this was going on, he'd also
Seems-
taken up a form of stick fencing that regularly left him with black eyes, welts, and cuts on his hands, but that's beside the badass point.
Fair
Because
enough.
he was not done. He was just getting started. That year, he personally intervened in a coal miners' strike, mediating between the miners and J.P. Morgan to strike a bargain that raised wages and limited hours, but prevented the formation of a union. And then in 1903,
Yeah,
with
work
the
with the
swell
kid.
of support from Ida Tarbell's articles, he moved on a much more ambitious set of bills. He wanted to create a Department of Commerce and Labor with an investigative agency called the Bureau of Corporations that would monitor and inspect companies for antitrust violations. In addition, he wanted to give more power to the already existing Interstate Commerce Commission and pass a law preventing railroads from giving rebates that diverted from published rates. All of this would give him the
Oh,
tools
yeah.
to go after the
Exactly,
trusts
but
on a
here you
broad
go.
scale.
Big stick.
Congress was not cooperative. Republicans tried to prevent the proposal from coming to a vote, and many Democrats, hoping to paint Roosevelt as pro-trust, felt he didn't go far enough. But both parties said there simply wasn't enough time in the spring congressional session for this discussion. So Roosevelt used the bully pulpit. He threatened to call a special session, which would keep the congressmen from going home. And he engaged the press, letting it be known that Rockefeller had sent out telegrams to a number of Republican senators calling in favors from a lifetime of financial gifts. Oh yeah, the public uproar was enormous. Newspapers speculated which senators had been bought by Rockefeller and the trusts. Reporters bombarded senators' offices, and gradually, Roosevelt got his votes. In a last-ditch attempt to scuttle the laws, Standard Oil sent a team of lawyers to D.C. with instructions to draft an amendment that would blunt the bills and pass it to their Republican allies. But then Pulitzer's New York World found out about this, and the lawyers fled the Capitol with reporters on their heels. Roosevelt had...
Oops. I mean, at this point, you'd think it would have been easier just to be like, okay, we'll just figure out new ways to make business. Not just, hire lawyers for, long legal battles and just bribes. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much they're spending on the bribes. I mean, at this rate, you've been like, okay, let's just accept it and just move on. Because at this rate, we got to figure out some other way to make business. Right? Just saying. So at this rate, baby. Honestly, that's what my thought process would be if I was running a business like this. Like, okay, it's all the trust. This isn't worth it. Let's just take care of something else. You know what I mean? You gotta admit, right? Anyway.
At his Bureau of Corporations, his legislation, and the next year, his first victory. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the government had been right to break up the Northern Securities Company.
Nice.
The era of
one
trust
vote.
busting had begun, and John D. Rockefeller would become the richest fugitive in America.
Oh, speaking of, breaking standard. Yeah, good luck, standard. Have fun.
Election night, November 8th, 1904. President Theodore Roosevelt eats dinner with his family, awaiting results. It had been a rough campaign. Conservatives in his party had planned to oust Roosevelt, this unelected radical, at the convention, and only failed because their candidate died. Plus, with it considered unseemly to campaign while in office, because that used to be a thing, Roosevelt had to leave speeches and rallies to surrogates like William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, painted Roosevelt as erratic and owned by the trusts.
Yeah, right.
Parker had even claimed that Roosevelt's campaign manager had used his
been
former
true.
position
There's
as
no
head
evidence
of the
back
new
up.
Bureau of Corporations to shake companies down for donations, a lie that Parker embarrassingly retracted when Roosevelt challenged him to provide evidence. But now, the first telegrams begin to come in. It's a historic landslide. And by 9 p.m., Parker concedes.
Thank you.
For the first time, the American people have chosen Roosevelt as their leader, and they've given him a mandate to go after the trusts. The election of 1904 was, up until that time, one of the most decisive in American history. Roosevelt won the Electoral College 336 to 140 and captured 18.8% more of the popular vote than Parker,
Nice.
the highest popular vote margin
Yeah,
since
James
1820, when James Monroe ran unopposed. The only thing that hurt him was the issue of campaign contributions. Parker had pointed out that Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and other magnates had made enormous donations to Roosevelt's political campaign, implying that he had been bought out by Standard. In fact, the attack was so worrying, Roosevelt's campaign manager had even tried to get the president to decline the corporate donations and rely instead on small individual contributions from supporters. But rather than seeing money in politics as a systematic problem that needed fixing, Roosevelt interpreted the attack as a slight against his honor. He preferred to keep the contributions as a way to show that no matter if Rockefeller gave $100,000 to his campaign, he was still going to pursue Standard. He felt that turning away the donations would be a signal that he'd done something wrong. And now that he'd won, he'd prove how wrong Parker had been. Armed with the Sherman Antitrust Act, his new Bureau of Corporations, a progressive press stoking outrage against monopolies, and a huge popular mandate, Roosevelt was finally in position to do battle against trust abuses, just in time for an opportunity to fall right into his lap. Oil drilling had been going on in Kansas since 1860, but output was low until an independent driller hit a gusher in 1892. It was the first strike in what's now known as the Mid-Continent Field, an oil deposit eventually determined to stretch from Kansas through Oklahoma to Texas and Louisiana. Independent producers rushed in to drill, followed by Standard Oil. At first, the independents were actually happy for Standard to be there. It put up oil pipelines and arranged railroad systems to transport the oil out, as well as establishing refineries. But then when it controlled all of the ways to get oil out, Standard raised the transportation costs and flooded the market with cheap oil, causing independent producers that had been making over $1 a barrel to now only making around 35 cents. No one could make a profit, and they were either going out of business or headed for buyouts. So they sounded the alarm, and Ida Tarbell showed up. To get there, she traveled by horse-drawn wagon through the worst sandstorm in decades. But when she arrived, she was greeted as something between a hero and a prophet. Hosted with parades, forced to give speeches from her hotel window, followed by reporters. It seemed she'd become the most famous woman in America. And though the crowds disturbed her writing, her celebrity meant more people approached her to tell their stories. And those stories were familiar. It seems Standard Oil was following the same playbook they'd used during the Pennsylvania oil wars of her youth, using secret railroad rebates and price fixing to drive competitors out, playing favorites on pipeline rates, bribing legislators to sink or blunt proposed antitrust laws, even tampering with juries. But as she wrote her article, she got a visit from James R. Garfield, the son of the former president and the current commissioner of the Bureau of Corporations. It seemed he was going down to Kansas himself to look into Standard's practices and was using Tarbell's notes as a guide. He verified every point she made, and then went back to Washington to help craft a two-pronged legal offensive against Standard. The first case would be based on the illegal rebates Standard had received, while the other would be a Sherman Antitrust Act suit, claiming the company was an illegal monopoly acting in restraint of trade. The illegal rebates case was the easiest to prosecute. It began in March 1907, when the government formally charged Standard Oil of Indiana with 1,903 violations of the Elkins Act, the railroad rate law Roosevelt had pushed through in 1903. There's a fun numerical coincidence.
No kidding.
The jury found Standard guilty on all of those counts, and the judge issued a subpoena to Rockefeller, compelling him to testify about Standard's operations in order to assess the size of the penalty. U.S. Marshals fanned out from Chicago, visiting every residence Rockefeller owned. But Rockefeller had defied subpoenas before. When state courts investigating Standards served him in the past, he exploited their limited power by simply never going in person to that state. Yet the U.S. Marshals were unrelenting, trying to slip past his armed Pinkerton guards and causing him to move from house to house in secrecy. It couldn't last. July 6th, 1907, Chicago. There's a crowd outside the courthouse, yelling at Rockefeller as his guards muscle their way through. The game is up, it seems. He's too old to keep running, so he's come here to testify. But with a strategy. On the stand, as the judge questions him, Rockefeller plays a semi-senile old man. He flubs basic facts, claims not to be able to remember events or details from just a few years earlier, and repeats over and over that he'd stepped back from managing Standard over a decade ago. In one way, it works. John D. Rockefeller will not be going to prison. But in another way, it definitely doesn't. Because the judge decides to levy the maximum fine on every single rebated rail car. All 1,903 of them, fining Standard Oil of Indiana a whopping $29,240,000. It drew a gasp in the courtroom. The fine was by far the largest ever levied on an American corporation to that date. Granted, it would be appealed the next year, and a different judge eventually reversed it on a technicality. But just the fact that a judge had actually ruled against the trust and ruled hard in more ways than one encouraged prosecutors that they could now win in this arena. And the hits kept coming. In 1908, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst read out a series of letters he'd obtained where the vice president of Standard, John Archbold, sent multiple $15,000 checks to a senator and discussed antitrust legislation. Not a good look. Nope. Meanwhile, the Justice Department prepared its second case against Standard. It took years and 20,000 pages worth of supporting documents. But in 1909, the U.S. government sued Standard of New Jersey, the parent company of Rockefeller's empire. The Justice Department claimed that Standard was an illegal monopoly that used anti-competitive means like rebates, price fixing, undercutting, secretly operating companies claiming to be independent, and espionage against competitors to restrain trade. The U.S. government won. Again. And when Standard appealed to the Supreme Court, the U.S. government won again in an 8-1 decision, with the one dissenter essentially saying the decision didn't go far enough. The judgment meant that Standard Oil would be broken up into 34 companies. Rockefeller got the news of the breakup by telegram while he was on the golf course with a priest. It wasn't a surprise by then, and Standard had been preparing a game plan. Rockefeller turned to the priest and said, "If you have any money, buy stock in Standard Oil." Then he went on to shoot the best golf game of his life. And Rockefeller was right. As the breakup happened, forming 34 baby Standards, the company's stock went through the roof. And Rockefeller personally owned 25% of Standard. It quadrupled his wealth, making Rockefeller the first ever billionaire and probably at the time, the richest man on earth. And the Standard of yesterday became the companies we all know today. Standard of New Jersey became Esso, and after another merger, Exxon. Standard of New York became Mobil, Standard of California became Chevron, and Standard of Indiana became Amoco. Now, it's debatable.
Okay, actually, just gonna go back a sec. Looks like, funnily enough, they actually have the same color scheme. You know, white, red, white, blue. No. Seems similar. I think that was intentional? Just to be like, hey, we're still around, just under a different name. Or at least that's how I see it, but, Anyway.
Whether this actually fostered the competition that the government and court contended, because though separate, the companies still maintained an old boys network, and generally tried to carve up the country and stay out of each other's way. And in recent years, some like ExxonMobil have even begun to recombine, though none have the power or reach Standard did in its heyday. But though it was arguably an incomplete victory, a victory it was, and not the last. Because when Roosevelt first saw that landmark $29 million fine overturned by the courts, he realized the judicial branch could not take on the trusts alone. After all, Rockefeller and his ilk could always hire the best lawyers. No, to strike the trusts where it hurts, he would need legislation, and he knew exactly who he needed to target. The ones at the center of the illegal rebates. The railroads. Choo-choo.
Yep, all aboard. Come to the train wreck. Sorry, I have to say it. I mean,
the House of Representatives, February 28, 1906. Right. Theodore Roosevelt's new pet legislation, the Hepburn Bill, has just passed the House. Nice. The act prevents the kind of behavior Standard Oil and the railroads engaged in to create monopolies and control prices. Justice Department lawyers are still fighting for Standard's breakups in the courts, but Roosevelt has realized that's not a productive avenue. They'll never catch everyone. To break the power of the trusts, Roosevelt can't rely on prosecuting illegal behavior after it's occurred. He has to prevent it with legislation. But the progressive-leaning House of Representatives isn't the real fight. That'll happen in the more conservative Senate, where Roosevelt will have to broker deals and make alliances to get the bill through, including with the congressman he hates most. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt gave a public speech discussing the role of journalism in the progressive movement. Illustrating the good and ill of crusading journalism, he compared them to a character from the philosophical novel Pilgrim's Progress, who used a rake to clear away muck.
The men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society,
Roosevelt said.
But only if they know when to stop raking the muck.
This speech showed Roosevelt's sometimes rocky relationship with the progressive press, who always pushed him to go further, but who he was also happy to cultivate and promote if it served his purposes. Indeed,
Fair, I
political
guess.
cartoons
Sometimes
of
you
the
gotta
day
work with it.
cast Roosevelt as a crusading king, surrounded by knights representing prominent journalists and publications, with Ida Tarbell as Joan of Arc. The speech also gave
That's
Americans a new term for these investigative, story-breaking journalists:
And there it
muckrakers,
is.
a label, for what it's worth, that Ida Tarbell hated. However, she was
Oof.
not the only investigative journalist taking on corruption and big business. In the same issue where she began her series on Standard Oil, her McClure's colleague Ray Baker took on the use of intimidation and violence by labor unions against their own members. But it was Baker's investigation into a miner workers' strike in Colorado that first brought him Theodore Roosevelt's attention. There, corporations, crooked politicians, and banks had ostensibly squeezed the miners' union on the issue of working hours until they'd ignited a full-on revolt, with miners bombing company mine shafts and beating or assassinating new workers brought in to replace the strikers. The governor, a banker himself, declared martial law and brought in the army. They arrested miners without warrants and threw them on deportation trains. One soldier threatened a judge with a bayonet outside of his own court. Baker, eminently fair, charted how foul play on all sides had escalated the conflict, and shared his article with Roosevelt before publication.
Jeez. I'll be honest, I'm starting to see why people, I don't know, are a little nervous about unions, because honestly, with those kind of unions, no wonder. Yikes. I mean, honestly, I can't blame them, but still, a little overboard.
Roosevelt liked the piece so much, he wrote a statement endorsing the article. And that collaboration would not be their last, as the young president and crusading investigator found their interests aligning again the next year on the issue of railroads. Baker's next article examined how the railroad trusts, many partially owned by titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, used lawyers and corporate structures to skirt the new laws against rebates and still offer discounted rates to favored big businesses. Baker pointed out that this was particularly unfair, considering that the government had literally given the land to railroads in order for them to lay track. If it was a public service, it should serve the public good. Once again, Roosevelt got early access to Baker's research, passing it on to the Interstate Commerce Commission and progressive lawmakers to begin crafting what would become the Hepburn Bill. Now, without getting too technical, the Hepburn Rate Act, named after the man who introduced it, would empower the ICC to regulate railroad shipping rates in the interest of leveling the playing field for businesses small and large. Going beyond rebates, the Hepburn Bill allowed the ICC to look at railroad companies' books and made it illegal to give out free passes to other companies' goods. And crucially for Rockefeller's business, it also covered pipelines. It passed the House of Representatives, where progressive Republicans were a major force, without amendment, and barreled onto the Senate, where it hit a brick wall. Because there was one group that did not want this to pass. The conservative wing of Roosevelt's own Republican Party, many of whom had taken campaign contributions and personal free passes from the railroads. Chief among them was Republican leader Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was well known for killing progressive legislation that would impact big business. Having previously monkeyed with tariff rates to please the Sugar Trust, he also personally owned part of Rhode Island's trolley system until earlier that year he sold it to a railroad trust for an enormous profit. Aldrich and his conservatives attacked Roosevelt as a secret socialist, tying him to the furthest left elements of the party who wanted to nationalize the railroads. But in addition to refusing to pass...
Honestly, that's kind of ironic, because we do have a national, national railroad. And at this point, the private stuff just didn't work out since no one was using the trains. At least that's what I've heard. But anywho, moving along. Guess we're about to make that senator he hated the most.
The bill. Aldrich decided to hobble it further by delegating leadership on it to a prominent Democrat, and the senator Roosevelt hated most. Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Now, it's really hard to understate what an odious figure Benjamin Tillman was. Called Pitchfork Ben for his fiery speeches, Tillman rose to prominence during the fall of Reconstruction, when he led a paramilitary terrorist militia called the Red Shirts in a campaign of ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, and murder against South Carolina's black community. A vocal proponent of the idea that African Americans must either be subservient or exterminated, he was for decades the most open white supremacist in Congress. And just for the record, in 1906, that's really saying something. He and Roosevelt loathed each other. In 1901, Roosevelt invited African American educator Booker T. Washington to formally and publicly dine with the Roosevelt family at the White House, the first time a black man had done so.
Nice.
Tillman's response to this act was so racist that I'm not even going to repeat it here.
Thank
I'll
you.
put it up here on the screen so you get an idea what kind of man this guy was.
Okay, wait. What do you say? Okay, thanks for censoring it. The action of the President Roosevelt entertained that, will necessary are killing 1,000, in the South before they learn their place again. Wolf. Jeez. Yeah, I think you can already tell what the ends are, so yeah. Woof. Again, I know 1906 and the civil rights thing is about 60 years out, so yeah, you can see how we get away with this. But nowadays, someone said that, well, bye, and good luck with getting a political career after this, or any career. I mean, come on, you know it's true, but Jesus Christ. Oh. Had to put
Their
your own
relationship
there, huh?
deteriorated further the next
Yeah,
year
no
when
kidding.
Roosevelt withdrew Tillman's invitation to a White House dinner after he'd punched a fellow senator on the floor of Congress.
Damn.
And look, we could go on
I mean,
all
again,
day
can't
about
blame
how
him.
awful
I would
Tillman
do- I
is,
would do that
but
too.
ultimately this is an episode about railroad trusts. And I'm
Right.
pretty sure by now you get how bad this guy sucked.
Mm-hmm.
But as much as Roosevelt hated Tillman, he was also a major opponent of the trusts. In fact, he was part of the Democratic bloc, attacking Roosevelt for not going after the trusts even harder. Despite their mutual distaste, Roosevelt reached out to Tillman, opening a channel of communication to negotiate on the finer points of the bill. Things didn't change between them. In fact, they never met in person, instead talking through a go-between. But they did work together as Tillman steered the bill through committee.
Thank you,
Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued meeting with Ray Baker, getting his opinion on the legislation. Baker, to put it mildly, wasn't happy, because the Hepburn Bill was mostly concerned with regulating maximum shipping rates, ensuring railroads couldn't jack up prices on the smaller companies. But Baker argued the real problem was the minimum rates, because while raising rates got everyone's attention, it was the fact that the railroads played favorites by lowering rates for big companies that created unfair competition.
Not wrong.
He also showed Roosevelt how the railroads nickel and dimed smaller shippers by charging them more for elevator services, storage, refrigeration, and chronically underweighing shipments from favored companies. In fact, at this point, Baker pushed Roosevelt so hard to go even further than he was that the president became annoyed with him. Sure, he knew his ideas were good, but he also knew they wouldn't pass Congress, especially in his Tillman alliance. But Roosevelt's attempt to reach across the aisle failed. Tillman couldn't rally enough Democratic support to pass the bill, even combined with the Senate's progressive Republicans. Their partnership fractured, their relationship even worse, and Roosevelt back at square one. If he wanted to do
they're
anything,
stuck.
Roosevelt realized he needed a middle way. Because on one hand, he had Democrats and progressive Republicans who wanted to nationalize railroads, a solution conservatives would not accept, and on the other, he had conservatives that wanted to do nothing. So he started fresh, reverting back to the original bill before it had been augmented with amendments suggested by Baker, Tillman, and pretty much everyone else.
Wow.
It was a simpler bill, one that did what Roosevelt wanted, but was much more moderate. It passed.
There we go.
Sure, it was full of loopholes and extraneous amendments, and would need to be strengthened in 1910, but Roosevelt had done what was previously thought impossible, to restrain a trust not just with the courts, but with preemptive legislation. Even Tillman set aside his qualms and voted for it. And that was good,
Thank you, Tillman.
because even as Roosevelt celebrated his latest victory against the trusts,
Won't
a
last
new
long.
book had come out detailing shocking abuse,
Oh.
danger, and monopoly in another American industry, the slaughterhouses of Chicago. Meaning Roosevelt's next task was to take
The
a
FDA
cleaver to
coming
the
up.
meat trust.
Right. The meat grinder. We're near the end too, so shall we?
Chicago, Illinois, 1904. Upton Sinclair has realized that,
Sinclair,
provided he carries a lunch pail, he can go basically anywhere, blending in with workers while walking the floors of Chicago's infamous slaughterhouses and packing plants, watching men work industrial meat cutters and grinders. His goal is to expose the grotesque labor abuses of the meat industry in a serialized novel he's writing for the socialist
General.
newspaper Appeal to Reason. He sees workers lose fingers to saws and subsequently lose their jobs and financial security, witnesses the mistreatment of the largely Lithuanian immigrants working the factories, hears stories of men falling into meat grinders, minced with the meat, and sees foul droppings and diseased meat swept off the floor and put into sausages. The resulting novel, The Jungle, will spur Roosevelt's next big battle against the trusts. Despite being labeled a socialist by his conservative Republican rivals, Theodore Roosevelt in actuality had little regard for socialism. In fact, he was largely pro-business. Much like Ida Tarbell, he didn't particularly care how large the trusts got, provided they did it honestly. Actually, it could be argued that his reputation as a radical trustbuster is undeserved, since he didn't really bust most of the trusts he went after. He was really more of a trust regulator. In fact, Roosevelt didn't believe trusts were inherently bad, and he often admired the charity work undertaken by captains of industry like Rockefeller and Carnegie. And anytime someone proposed actual socialist policies, like nationalizing the railroads, Roosevelt generally ran the other direction, because he disliked socialism and socialists. And as a result, was skeptical of Upton Sinclair's claims when he first read The Jungle, particularly...
Fair, but... Jeez. I never really understood the hate on socialism. Like, I guess they're just thinking like, oh, it's too radical. If you're too radical, you're a socialist. But, I don't know. Like, it does seem like a good idea. But honestly, it does sound like a, catch-all term for anyone who didn't agree with, like, say, oh, we don't like how this, oh, you're just a damn socialist or something like that. That's just how I'm seeing it, but anyway.
Since Sinclair's novel ended with a heavy-handed scene of the protagonist attending a socialist meeting as a way to lecture and convert the reader. Despite that, he invited Sinclair to the White House to talk about the book and the conditions in the meat plants. Of course, he thought Sinclair was exaggerating and even referred to him as a crackpot. But if just a third of what Sinclair claimed was true, then that meant there was something very wrong in the nation's meat industry. The picture of poverty, exploitation, and the revoltingly unhygienic practices he'd painted in The Jungle was so viscerally upsetting to the public that both domestic and international orders for American meat dropped by half. So despite his skepticism, Roosevelt dispatched a group of his most trusted government officials to inquire about plant conditions. Surprise inspections, which the Meat Trust unfortunately got wind of and went on a 3-week sanitation campaign. But even that wasn't enough. When Roosevelt received the subsequent report, he was shocked to discover that Sinclair had not lied about factory conditions. They discovered unbelievable filth, from walls painted with old blood, to tuberculosis-infected beef being packaged for sale, to rotting pork being bathed in preservatives like formaldehyde and borax, to meat that was entirely mislabeled, passing off goat or horse as beef. Popular fury was so intense that this was one blow against the trusts Roosevelt wouldn't even have to fight for. He drew up 2 bills for the 1906 Congress. The first was the Pure Food and Drug Act, a wide-ranging statute that banned the foreign and interstate traffic of mislabeled, impure, or contaminated food and medicine. It allowed for the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the Food and Drug Administration, to carry out inspections and refer violations to prosecutors. It also required the food and drug manufacturers to label major ingredients, a provision striking out at both mislabeled meat and the U.S. patent medicine industry, which regularly sold products with secret ingredients that included cocaine and opium. In fact, many of these medicines were also loaded with sugars and flavoring, which led to a rash of children overdosing when they drank the bottles like candy. It also labeled 10 substances common in medicine, including alcohol, opium, cocaine, cannabis, and morphine, as addictive and dangerous, requiring that their presence be disclosed on the packaging. Products found in violation could be seized and destroyed at the company's expense, in addition to a fine. Next came the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which mandated Department of Agriculture inspections of every animal before and after slaughter, spelled out standards for sanitation at meat plants, and authorized the government to monitor operations. Despite these 2 victories, Sinclair himself was disappointed that people had fixated on food purity rather than the condition of workers. I aimed for the heart, he reflected, and hit them in the stomach. But even so, it was the end of an extraordinary legislative season. In fact, the 59th U.S. Congress was one of the most productive in history. In addition to the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, and Hepburn Railroad Rates Act, the 59th Congress also passed a key law regulating citizenship, an Antiquities Act, allowing the president to declare national monuments, and chartered the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which played a major role in developing American education. But despite all this success, it should be noted that the Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act were compromises, watered down from what Roosevelt had truly hoped for. And compromise was something Roosevelt increasingly became familiar with during his last years in office. Because in the exuberance of his election night win in 1904, he'd made a promise that he now regretted. Having served nearly 2 terms due to McKinley's assassination, he had promised not to run again. And while that freed his hand to be more active and take politically risky positions in his second term, it also meant that both the trusts and conservative Republicans knew that they just had to wait him out. In 1908, he proposed a bill to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, but saw it shot down in Congress. He then tried to set up a National Bureau of Insurance in order to tame anti-consumer practices in the insurance market, but that was dead on arrival as well. However, even without Congress, Roosevelt could effect change, sometimes merely by the threat of an antitrust suit. Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel, the most prominent steel trust, actually voluntarily agreed to an investigation by the Bureau of Corporations, and other large trusts agreed to cooperate as well. But there was one time he couldn't help but let the trusts win. November 4th, 1907, the White House. The country is in a panic. Stock market dives and the sudden crash of several trust banks, wiping out depositors' savings, have plunged consumer confidence. People are terrified, moving their money out of the market, and worse, withdrawing it from banks. If this continues, the entire system might collapse. But J.P. Morgan, a man Roosevelt has tangled with when he filed an antitrust suit over the Northern Securities Company, has a plan. You see, part of this new panic of 1907 had come from a large brokerage house, borrowing massive sums with the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company as collateral. But now that TC&I stock price was collapsing, if U.S. Steel purchased TC&I, it would calm the markets. However, U.S. Steel already owns 60% of the steel market and doesn't want to face an antitrust suit as a monopoly. So they ask for Roosevelt to sign off on it personally. They will save the economy, but in return, he can't go after them for the purchase. It's Monday morning. The stock market will open in an hour. Roosevelt has to decide fast. He has no choice. He agrees to let the deal go through. Ultimately, Roosevelt would use the Sherman Antitrust Act 40 more times during his presidency, more than his 3 predecessors combined. And his ally and chosen successor, William Howard Taft, would use it 75 times. But while Roosevelt's battle against the trusts has become legendary, the results themselves were more mixed. As we mentioned previously, the breakup of Standard Oil, his biggest victory, may not have actually led to much more competition. In the 1920s, when Ida Tarbell wrote a retrospective article on Standard's breakup, she pointed out that over a decade later, the competition that the government had hoped to create hadn't yet materialized. Maybe, she suggested, it would take another decade for the results to truly begin to show. Indeed, in our modern day, we can actually see parts of Standard recombining via merger, with Exxon and Mobil joining forces. But it's important to note that even these megacorporations only have a fraction of the power Standard once had, particularly because they fear antitrust suits. Breakups are rare, but in 1982, AT&T was forced to divest itself of the Bell telephone system. A 1999 case came close to breaking up Microsoft, and as we wrote this series, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Google, and the Federal Trade Commission, the successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, filed another against Facebook. Which just goes to show that even a century later, the big questions of Roosevelt's era still live on. Should the government provide a check on unrestrained capitalism? How can Congress regulate when its members are financially tied to companies? And what role does the press play in all of this? Because while Theodore Roosevelt gave us the tools to act if warranted, the question of when to use them is still up to us. And today...
Yeah, fair enough. There still are a lot of people that, well, have a hard time using this stuff. Well, just only as much as you can use. Or at least know what you can do. I think that's the question. When to use it, when to strike, I guess. For him, he never had a chance. Or at least he did have some shots. But, well, you can't always win. You know, I guess that's the way to look at it. But, what do you guys think? Let me know what you guys think of the truth busting. Till next time, adios.